Peer pressure. Of course we're not affected by it, are we? I mean, when those immediately around you accentuate to one idea or one opinion, and yet you're still not convinced, where does that leave you? Have you ever yielded or been held captive by the opinions or the prevailing mood of those around you? We all, to varying degrees, have experienced peer pressure. And there's good in peer influence, and equally, of course, not so good peer pressure. You know, it's not just a youth thing either. Many adults have based their decisions on peer pressure, and they've come up with results that they've all too often regretted later. You know, it's a subtle kind of social pressure that influences and dictates, for example, what we wear, how we talk, and what we do. Do changing fashion trends, for example, affect your purchasing habits? Are you tempted, for example, to try drugs because others are doing it? Are you afraid of your friends finding out, for example, that for the first time in your life, you're asking questions about Jesus? Stay with us. We'll look at two very intelligent but different men who privately wrestled with those very same issues. Many years ago, a man called Nicodemus came to Jesus by the cover of night. And you can read what happened in the 3rd chapter of John. Now, Nicodemus was a part of the influential Jewish sect called the Pharisees, who, according to the gospel accounts, opposed Jesus on almost everything that he did. It was really a kind of power struggle that played itself out in their almost daily confrontations. Now, the Pharisees' role as ruling council in Jewish society dictated almost every facet of their daily lives, from ritual washings, fastidious observances of a whole lot of trivial matters, to the oral traditions surrounding Sabbath observance. And you can read about their frequent confrontations with Jesus. It's no wonder Nicodemus didn't want to be seen fraternizing with him. It would have been politically incorrect. It would have risked his standing among his fellow Pharisees. And John, one of Jesus' disciples, gives us some remarkable insight into what was happening when John wrote about those events. Yet at the same time, many, even among the leaders, believed in him. That's Jesus. But because of the Pharisees, they would not confess their faith for fear that they would be put out of the synagogue, for they loved the praise from men more than the praise from God. Jesus' conversation that night with Nicodemus is a subject all by itself. Nicodemus asked Jesus about his identity, and Jesus chooses to talk about rebirth. And later that evening, when the two men would have parted, it's anyone's guess the turmoil that was going on in Nicodemus's heart. Sometime later, when Jesus was again hunted by the Pharisees, you can get a hint of Nicodemus's ambivalence as reflected when he asked his question among his peers, saying, "Does our law condemn anyone without first hearing him to find out what he's doing?" Thankfully, there's more to the story. When Jesus was finally crucified, Nicodemus appears again together with a Joseph of Arimathea, and together they courageously asked the Roman governor Pilate for the body of Jesus. And together they buried Jesus according to Jewish custom. Now, this raises the question, did it take the brutal death of Jesus for Nicodemus to finally break free from the peer pressure that was holding him back? Now, not all the Pharisees were of the same ilk, because later on we read of another very different Pharisee, and his name was Saul. Saul's experience was very different from Nicodemus in that he really kicked against the very notion of Jesus being the Messiah. And it seems that Saul's burning ambition became one of destroying any Christians that he could find. You know, in his opinion, those Christians defiled those very traditions that were overseen by the Pharisees. And so, as recorded in the book of Acts, Saul the Pharisee is determined to travel to the distant city of Damascus in Syria with a letter of authority from the ruling council in order to imprison and punish any Christians he found there. There's no doubt that Saul was a deeply entrenched Pharisee of his time and thoroughly schooled in their traditions. So too was Nicodemus, whom Jesus noted was a teacher in Israel. But both men, however, were, number one, teachers in the tradition of the Pharisees. They were both well schooled in the Scriptures, and both, it seems, were troubled by this Messiah business. Now, the differences in the two men are really worth noting, worth exploring, as both were confronted with who Jesus was. Now, whereas Nicodemus came to Jesus in the cover of night, Jesus came to Saul in a blinding light. You see, not only did Jesus not meet their worldview of a Messiah, he didn't adhere to the Jewish traditions of the elders. And besides, the impact of Jesus on the lives of common people, let alone his threat to their standing among the Pharisees, their rulership, their governing council, Jesus' influence was just too great to ignore. As we follow Nicodemus' story, his curiosity was stymied by peer pressure. He didn't want to be seen true to his inner convictions. Saul, however, while of the same religious tradition, is contrasted by his sheer rugged individualism. His wasn't a secret investigation into Jesus' identity, but rather a determined, albeit misguided, mission to destroy Christ. And so Jesus didn't mince his words when he confronted Saul. Jesus said to Saul, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? I'm Jesus whom you are persecuting." In the end, both Nicodemus and Saul, in their own ways, in their different stories, when confronted by Jesus, eventually made a complete turnaround. You know, both men repented. Nicodemus was no longer afraid of what his peers even thought. It even didn't matter to him when he defiled himself by handling the corpse of Jesus. You see, as a Pharisee, he wasn't permitted to touch a dead body. And Saul, now renamed Paul, spent the rest of his life preaching Christ and Him crucified, the very message for which he himself was persecuted and eventually died for. So the question remains, comparing the parallels of what we've just discussed, where are you on your journey? Are you perhaps a little bit like Nicodemus? Or maybe you can relate better to Paul. Is peer influence holding you back from coming to a covenant relationship with Jesus Christ? Are you worried about what your family or your friends might say, or how it might affect your political or corporate status? Perhaps like the rugged individual Saul, you don't know what you don't know. See, Saul's intellect and education didn't allow him to admit that he may just be wrong. You know, it's time to take an honest look at where you are in your relationship to Jesus. It's time to examine what the Scriptures really say. It's time to put God to the test, and in coming to Him, to really finally find Him. Nicodemus took those first tentative steps that night in coming to Jesus. And when Jesus confronted Saul, who became Paul, both men could finally no longer deny the overwhelming evidence. What about you? Jesus wants you to follow Him. But the next step, however, is yours for the taking.